PPSh-41 is the most produced submachine gun in history, with over 5 million units built during World War II. To make that number sound even more impressive, the Germans produced around 1 million of their famous MP-40s. But the real point here is just how effective this weapon was, and why it terrified German soldiers so much. The Germans also respected it and would happily take one from a dead or captured Red Army soldier. In fact, they liked it so much that they even created their own version. We have plenty of interesting things to cover here, so let's start from the very beginning. In the 1930s, the Soviet military saw submachine guns as secondary support weapons, with the famous Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle being the main armament. However, during the Winter War against Finland between 1939 and 1940, the Soviet army would see how Finnish Suomi KP-31 submachine guns, with high-capacity drum magazines, could be devastating in surprise raids against soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles. Those rifles had a powerful cartridge and long range, but a slow rate of fire, which could be the deciding factor when fighting at close range, like in urban settings. The Germans would pay for this realization dearly when Stalingrad happened. That Suomi submachine gun with the 71-round drum would leave a deep impression on Soviet planners, who would soon come up with their own version. First to come was the PPD-40, but it was expensive and difficult to produce in huge numbers. So after that came the infamous PPSh-41, which was a simplified and more effective version. It was now cheap, reliable, easy to produce in the millions, while terrifyingly effective in combat. Pistolet Pulemiot Shpagina is the full name, but soldiers called it Papasha, meaning something like daddy. The first bizarre yet ingenious thing about this weapon is its simplicity, both in operation and production. Stamped sheet metal parts were much easier to produce than milling. Even old Mosin-Nagant barrels were cut in half and repurposed to create submachine guns, as those barrels were also in the 7.62 caliber. It could be produced dirt cheap by unskilled labor in makeshift factories, in just 5.6 man-hours per unit. As Nazi Germany, with Operation Barbarossa, threatened the Soviet Union's very existence and their army suffered shortages in everything, this weapon came at just the right time. It began as an emergency project, but would actually become the defining feature of the Red Army and its symbol, as very soon it could be seen just everywhere. While most armies usually issued submachine guns to special forces, officers, or tank crews, the Soviets would turn this concept upside down, creating whole companies armed just with them. And the Germans were the first to learn the hard way just how effective they would be. The caliber, of course, is a quite interesting pistol cartridge, the 7.62 by 25 Tokarev, which we'll discuss a bit more when comparing it to the German MP-40 chambered in 9mm Luger. It operated from an open bolt in an extremely simple blowback action. Early versions had a selector for semi and full auto fire, but even this was later simplified further to just full auto. First magazines were the 71-round drums. That gave the weapon a huge supply of ammo before needing to reload, at least in theory, because the PPSh fired around 20 rounds per second, but that also meant that in under 4 seconds, you sprayed your enemy with 70 rounds. However, the drums had issues with reliability and were very slow and complicated to reload, so later in the war, it was changed to 35-round box magazines. Just keep this in mind, a 35-round mag is emptied in under 2 seconds, and imagine you have a bolt-action Kar-98 with 5 rounds against a Soviet vodka-fueled squad liberating their homeland from brutal occupiers. The Soviets quickly started arming entire platoons and companies with the PPSh, especially those involved in urban close-quarter fighting, and the weapon just immediately proved what it could do. Very soon, it was common to see whole squads of Soviet infantry armed with nothing but submachine guns and grenades, launching ferocious surprise attacks. Later in the war, they were deployed alongside T-34 tanks, riding on top of them directly into combat, breaking through German lines and dismounting to engage infantry at close range and protect the tanks. A submachine gun company could infiltrate enemy lines and hit machine gun or artillery positions in sudden shock attacks, often causing panic and confusion among the defenders. However, its biggest infamy was earned in the Battle of Stalingrad, where Soviet General Vasily Chuikov implemented a terrifying tactic when faced with the better-equipped German 6th Army. The so-called hugging the enemy tactic would define the fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad, in terrain that was just built for this weapon. This way, the Germans couldn't use their artillery as effectively because they were too close to enemy troops. Brutal room-to-room, floor-to-floor fights were fought, and the Germans would be outright terrified by Soviet special storm groups. Here, 4 to 8 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, and knives, sometimes even flamethrowers, would infiltrate German lines, usually at night. They would catch the Germans off guard and jump into their hideouts, spraying rooms with automatic fire and grenades. In this kind of fighting, the PPSh's extremely high rate of fire of over 1,200 rounds per minute was deadly effective. A single soldier could storm a room and empty the magazine in 4 seconds, spraying Germans with 70 rounds at point-blank range. We couldn't even imagine such a number of bullets fired in an enclosed space, ricocheting off the walls in a room where a dozen soldiers were gathered. In some sort of a plot twist, the Germans in Stalingrad began equipping their elite assault pioneers and Stoßtruppen units with the PPSh, just like the Soviets did. The Germans would learn the hard way that in such conditions, compact automatic weapons simply ruled, and they were desperately urging High Command to send them more MP40s. One of the important things was the PPSh's reliability in harsh conditions, which defined the Eastern Front. That was actually part of the reason the Germans used it so much when captured. Unlike their high-quality submachine guns, the PPSh was rugged and simple, nothing fancy about it. Basically, there wasn't much that could go wrong with it. It handled freezing temperatures and mud with ease. The bore was chrome-lined in most models, and the weapon could just take rough treatment and still fire when needed, which mattered the most. When German soldiers heard the distinctive fire of the PPSh, similar to their MG42 for example, they pretty much knew they were in trouble. That meant enemy infantry was close by, and where there's one, there's usually a lot more of them. A massed infantry rush with everyone armed with such an absurdly high rate of fire weapon is not something you'd be indifferent to. And to better understand the German fear of it, we can compare it to their MP40. It was chambered in 9mm Luger, which had significantly lower muzzle velocity than the 7.62 Tokarev. The MP40 gave just half the rate of fire of the PPSh, although with that came more control and accuracy, again, in theory, but it wasn't as good for longer range or penetration power. The Tokarev round could go through concrete blocks and be more effective even up to 200 yards, despite not being designed for such range. The 9mm gave better stopping power at close range, but the Tokarev compensated for that by spitting out more rounds. The MP40 was undoubtedly better built in terms of quality, but the PPSh's pure volume, both in firepower and units produced, combined with working in all conditions, was simply overwhelming. In 1 second, the MP40 could spray out 10 rounds, whereas the PPSh could 20. And that mattered a lot in the kind of engagements the Eastern Front turned into, with more and more urban battles. And when you add to that tens of Soviet soldiers firing at once, it was simply overwhelming fire, despite being, in essence, a pistol caliber. Oh, and by the way, this is the so-called fire hedgehog. 88 PPShs were mounted in a bomber's bomb bay to strafe infantry from above. The idea was quickly abandoned, but we had to mention it just to show how strange it was. Although it was an extremely effective weapon, the PPSh had its share of flaws as well. Because of the hurried wartime production, parts often had a loose fit, so when you shook the weapon, it would rattle. And well, that could reveal your position at night if you were trying to creep up on a German holdout. Another big issue was its safety, or more accurately, the lack of it. Since it mostly fired only in full auto and had just a simple crude latch holding the bolt, dropping it could cause the entire magazine to be fired uncontrollably. A PPSh going off around your comrades without warning is not something you would want. There were several stories of this happening, usually among partisans, where someone would accidentally get shot this way. One signature quirk showed up at night. Because of its short, ported barrel and high rate of fire, it produced a distinctive, bright, three-pronged jet of flame when firing, which gave away your position. However, its strengths far outweighed the negative sides. It excelled in the things that were actually winning battles, and that was firepower, robustness, and ease of use and production. It was not long before the PPSh earned respect from the German side, but this respect would grow into something more as they ended up developing their own version of it. Because German squads were structured around the Kar-98 rifle, only officers usually carried machine pistols. In fact, only about 1 in 10 German soldiers had a submachine gun, or later, the even more scarce STG-44. Seeing how effective the Soviet PPSh was, they at first began using captured war trophies. The German military actually began sanctioning this practice, but the weapons were soon officially adopted into Wehrmacht service under the category of captured arms. They could use the near-identical 7.62 x 25 Mauser round, and more than 10,000 of them were converted and rechambered to fire 9mm. They were given a new barrel and used MP40 magazines with an adapter. Many German soldiers actually preferred the original Soviet caliber over the 9mm. By 1943 and 1944, the Soviets further refined this submachine gun and introduced the PPS-43. It was chambered in the same round, but now smaller, lighter, and even further simplified. It had simpler sheet metal construction and only 35-round box magazines with a folding stock. It was useful for tank crews and remained deadly effective in close combat. But the trusty PPSh-41 remained in production and wide service throughout the whole war. By some accounts, it is estimated that over 55% of Soviet infantrymen were armed with some version of the PPSh. Their tactics shifted to infantry and tank combined charges and extremely aggressive close-quarters fighting, which was quite a nightmarish development for German soldiers desperately trying to hold their positions as the tide of the war turned. The PPSh is so effective that it can still be seen today in ongoing conflicts. It saw heavy action again in the Korean and Vietnam Wars after World War II. However, in the 1950s, the submachine gun and bolt-action rifle concepts were both merged into the assault rifle, combining the best traits of each with an intermediate cartridge. But submachine guns still remained in use, especially among special forces and police units.